Hi, I'm Gabriela Houston. I'm a Polish UK-based author of Slavic-inspired novels for adults and children. Welcome to my channel where we discuss storytelling in all its forms. It's my belief that storytelling is an intrinsic part of everyone's life, as well as an important part of many professions. On the show, I talk to writers, artists, journalists, researchers, and more about how they use storytelling in their jobs and life. So today, I'm really excited to be interviewing Annika Asp. So Annika is a Finnish currently UK-based polyglot speaking 19 languages, and most importantly, a scholar of Byzantine medieval history. She was a founder and a president between the years 2012-2013 for GEM, Gateway to the Eastern Mediterranean. It was Postgraduate Society of a Center for Byzantine, Ottoman, and Modern Greek Studies. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Annika. I'm so glad you made it.
Thank you so much, Gabriela, for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I look forward to our conversation.
So, I mean, quite honestly, I don't actually know that much about the history of Byzantine. I was doing some research for a show, and there isn't all that much. You'd think for an empire of that kind of level of importance, there would be a lot more available. So, how did you actually decide to study, the history of Byzantium?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I'm not surprised. It's quite difficult to find information, and it's difficult to find kind of reliable, accurate information. You get little bits and pieces, and there's obviously much more around now than when I started studying back in the day. It's a bit of a long story, and I think a common factor amongst all Byzantinists is that there are some really interesting background stories as to what led us to study this field, because it's not something that's known particularly very well in Western Europe, a little bit better in some other parts of the world, particularly the territories that used to be part of the Byzantine Empire or state, or whichever way you want to call it. But for me, I'm from Finland, and I guess my kind of early perceptions of Byzantium really came from being kind of next to Russia, knowing about the Orthodox Church and having this idea of gold and icons and this kind of mysterious, shadowy darkness and this kind of court intrigue. But otherwise, I didn't know anything about Byzantium. I was always, I've been interested in history for since I was a little kid, really, but it was more the kind of stuff you see on TV. Egypt, that was massive, the Roman Empire. I studied a bit of Latin in school, actually, so there was that interest in ancient history. And I think I was really interested in history, and I think maybe around my early teens, I came to know a little bit more about medieval history. Now, this was before medieval history became cool. This was before Game of Thrones, all the kind of fantasy stuff based on medieval history, or before Lord of the Rings was made into films. It was just a book that was not very popular, and reading kind
What
of
do you mean it wasn't very popular?
wasn't very popular in Finland. It was, I guess, at that age.
Among Finnish academics, it was not particularly popular.
Well, I was an 11-year-old academic. Yeah, I was given that book, and it was
Yeah.
really heavy and really big, but it was fascinating. But those are not the things that sparked my interest. I think my interest came actually from classical music, and then being exposed to medieval music and hearing that this was all a reconstruction. So we have some notations and
Mm.
manuscripts, but various performers had to interpret the music really differently, and we had to just guess what it sounded like. So that's what really sparked my interest, kind of, I guess, in a way, a sensory experience of
Mm.
listening to something and immersing myself in it. And this was the time when kind of Gregorian chant was starting to get popular. So that's where medieval history started from. And when I started learning medieval history in schools, I was told about the Dark Middle Ages. It was an irrelevant period. There was the classical period. You had Greece and Rome, and everything was beautiful. The sun was shining brightly, and we have interesting things to learn. And then came the Renaissance, and you have a millennium of the Middle Ages right in
Had
between.
nothing.
Nothing interesting happened, and yeah, it was dark. There was decline, fragmentation. This was when I was young. Obviously, medieval studies is a very very big field about which I knew nothing at that time. I'm talking about popular perception in the 90s and early 2000s about medieval history. It was really geeky. It was really really strange to be interested in medieval history. But there you go. Um, and kind of let's fast forward a few years. I was lucky enough to get to travel a bit of the world through my work. I got to travel to India and I spent some time over there. And I got really interested in studying South Asian history. But I also was lucky enough to get to visit Istanbul, obviously, the Byzantine Constantinople. And I think that's really what kind of fascinated me, what kind of captured my curiosity for the Byzantine Empire. I think it just brought together everything that I was interested in, medieval history, but then a different aspect of it. So I had learned something about the European Western history. This was a part that actually I didn't know much about. And when I went to visit the sites, all came alive. I also got to travel and work in Bulgaria and in Greece and visit all these sites. And there was this common factor about the Byzantine Empire. And I was like, yeah, Byzantine what? I mean, I don't know anything about it. And then I think also having further in Eurasia and having had this interest for Indian history, Byzantium was kind of there in between the East and the West. And yeah, I think when I went to study history in university, I did my undergraduate in South Asian history. So I was obviously first interested in Western medieval history. I then started from studying Indian history, and I landed somewhere in between. I felt that kind of in the lands of the Byzantine Empire, that's where everything that I was interested in just came together. Plus, it was exotic, it was interesting, it was not much explored, so it was an opportunity to just discover a different civilization.
I mean, so many areas of influence just kind of, converged in that point. Sort of
Mm,
geographically, it was so important. But, also Byzantium was, changed hands many times.
mm.
And, it was conquered many times, like, so which aspects of Byzantine history are you most interested in?
Yeah, so I think I'm glad you've asked it because it was a really long period, and we'll come to conquests. I'll give you a little whistle-stop tour about that as well if you'd like. But I think um, Remember when I mentioned that I got interested in medieval history through this idea that something was dark and there was decline and fragmentation, and it was not very interesting. It was not very relevant, and no amazing science took place. So I think for similar reasons, I'm most interested in the end of the Byzantine Empire. So it's again a period. So basically, what I'm talking about is the period roughly between 1204 and 1453 AD. And again, it's quite a difficult period to study. It's not an era marked by grandeur and a kind of big, expanding, flourishing empire and all sorts of pomp and circumstance. There's fragmentation. There's a really, really old thing that's coming to an end. We see a kind of change in attitudes. And also there's a narrative of conquest. I think that's something I forgot to mention earlier. I think that's another thing that interested me. If there's on one hand, you have these kind of periods of time that are kind of considered dark and irrelevant and uninteresting. And then you have these narratives of conquest. So in South Asian history, you have the kind of conquest of India by various Muslim rulers, and some quite negative narratives around that. Again, in Byzantium, you have the conquest by Turks. And I was again interested in what does this mean? What was the experience for people? Was it a negative time? Was it a bad thing that the empire got conquered and gradually taken over by Turks? Is there a different perspective we could take here? And I just kind of try to just think. I mean, do you know that you're living in a dark age? Do you know that you're living in an era that people would later on describe as dark? Did food not taste as good in a dark age? Did the sun not shine so brightly? Did perfumes not smell as good? No, obviously, people were living their lives. And who knows, maybe in 100 years from now, 200 years from now, 1,000 years from now, we will be told, someone will write that we were living in a dark age.
I mean,
We
we're
don't
living in
know.
interesting times for sure. So, um,
Exactly, exactly. But that's the thing. You don't know. I was just interested in what did it feel like? What was it like? Are there other ways of looking at it? And then we come to all these things about is a good age one where we have big empires, or is a good age where there are lots of smaller nations, smaller states, obviously using those terms not in a very anachronistic way. So obviously they meant very different things for the Middle Ages than they mean today. But basically, where you have a world of opportunities where pretty much anyone could just make their fortunes and take a bit of land and start growing it. And obviously, the story of the Ottoman Empire is a really, really interesting story about success. So when we look at Byzantine decline, we look at the really, really exciting rise of the Ottomans. So yeah, I was just fascinating in that and looking at could we take a little slightly different perspective here and actually can we see parallels with our times? So yeah, and I'm still on that path.
Yeah. I mean, so when you are talking about like contemporary perspectives, how did the historical records of Byzantium survive the invasion of, Spartans, Athenians, Romans, Persians, Ottomans? Like how it changed hands so many times. How do you get at historical records and to get those contemporary perspectives?
Yeah, so just a couple of, I guess, just a couple of basic milestones here, particularly for anyone who is less familiar with Byzantine history, which I assume that, yeah, kind of,
Everybody, yeah,
yeah, everybody,
pretty much.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's so when we talk about Byzantium, we talk about a medieval empire. So this is basically we all know about the Roman Empire. Well, Byzantium was the Roman Empire, but it was East Rome. There isn't actually scholarly agreement of when it started. So it depends where you draw the line between the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. But various milestones in 313, that's AD, the capital of the Roman Empire was transferred to the east to Constantinople, which is today's Istanbul. So that's often seen as the earliest start date for the Byzantine Empire. Uh, some scholars would draw the line slightly later, so when Western Rome fell, and basically the East was the only bit that remained in the 5th century, or even later in the 7th century, where we had the rise of Islam and the conquest of some territories, that quite a significant amount of territories that used to be part of the Roman Empire, such as Egypt. So when those fell off, we kind of are left with the areas that usually are seen as the Byzantine lands. So what I'm talking about here is Anatolia, more or less more or less modern Turkey, and then some parts of the Balkans. But it's really there isn't good consensus of where the Byzantine Empire began. We all know where it ended. There is a date and a time for that. That's 29th of May, 1453, and that was the last conquest of Constantinople. So the last conquest was at that time when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II conquered Byzantium from the kind of Greek-speaking Orthodox rulers. But there were two other conquests before then. One in as late as 1204, actually. So up until then, you mentioned that there were many kind of attempts of various peoples to conquer Constantinople, and who would not have wanted to occupy such an amazing city and such an amazing territory. But all these attempts to conquer the city were successfully kind of fended off. The Constantinople had some really amazing defense system. It had some really strong land walls. It had and any wars fought more towards kind of other territories under its rule were also successfully defeated. So basically, the first time when we have the city of Constantinople being conquered is 1204. That's by the Crusaders. So you have the Western Crusaders. This is the fourth of the many crusades that took place. And instead of going to the Holy Land or to Egypt, it actually ended up ending at Constantinople. It's a long story, but that's the first conquest. And the second conquest is in 1261. So half a century later, and that's again by someone whom we think of as a Byzantine ruler. So this was someone who was Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian. So this was considered as a kind of reconquest. The city came back under Byzantine rule, and you get another 2 centuries of Byzantine rule until the story finally ends in 1453. And anything that happens after 1453 we see as Ottoman, and then later on as modern Turkish history. So those were the three conquests. The most significant of them, obviously, is the last one in 1453. And as you said, a lot of material was lost then. All the imperial archives, I think that was the biggest loss. The new Ottoman regime they didn't need access to the archives of their predecessors. They were setting up something of their own, and we don't have this huge repository of material left anymore. And that's a big difference in comparison to Western European countries, where, of course, you have much more documentary material.
Were those
Now,
records destroyed, or is there still hope they may be recovered one day?
so whatever was there in the archives, they have disappeared. But that doesn't mean we don't have any archival material from for Byzantium. So there are lots of other places where documentary evidence has survived. Byzantium was a hugely sophisticated bureaucracy. Everything was kind of given in 3 copies. You have lots of documentary evidence. And for instance, there's a place called Mount Athos in Greece. That's a peninsula where you have an all male kind of area of monasteries that has remained as it is since the Middle Ages. Their archives have survived. Or let's say, for instance, if you have a landowner anywhere under the territories that used to be under Byzantine rule, let's say they were given a special grant by the Byzantine emperor, something called a chrysobull or a golden sealed document. They would want to make sure to keep that special document in a very special place because that gave them their entitlement to their land and any special privileges, maybe even tax exemptions. So you have documentary
And would
evidence.
all those sort of land endowments have continued under the new regime? So, when the Byzantine sort of empire has sort of collapsed and has been taken over by the Ottoman Empire, sort of new empire, new rules. What happened to the previous landowners? Because you mentioned that, like, when people have been granted sort of land endowments and with the documents and the seals and all that, how did that sit with the new rulers?
It's a very big and complex topic. So that's something that's kind of studied in early Ottoman history. So yeah, obviously you would have some change and you would eventually see kind of the old Byzantine elites superseded by new Ottoman elites. But it's still the same people. I mean, it's not like the whole population of a territory was swapped with another population. And so it's basically, we see very gradual change. And in many areas, in many parts of the empire, we actually see continuity. And it just makes practically sense. So this kind of idea of massive disruption or something coming to an end, yes, the kind of something it's our decision to draw a line that we look at the Byzantine Empire and the Byzantine period as a kind of succession of Greek-speaking Orthodox rulers, and then we draw a line in 1453, and that's where we have kind of Turkish-speaking Muslim rulers. But you could look at things in a very different angles. You can look at things in kind of from very different perspectives, particularly when you study something else than the central administration. It's obviously a very, it makes sense to draw the line there. It's an easy place to draw the line. But when you look at continuity, when you look at some peripheral parts of the empire, many things actually ended up just kind of continuing as usual, and you'd have just different governors. You'd have an Ottoman governor rather than a Byzantine governor sent to the area. And same with the populations. Change happens really slowly when we're talking about the wholesale change. And I think, I guess the other point to note is that by the time Constantinople was conquered, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk so that it pretty much only consisted on the capital and a bit of hinterland behind it. But basically, a lot of the territories had already ended up under mostly Ottoman rule, but also under the rule of some other kind of smaller polities or states or kind of various rulers. So the change wasn't as drastic everywhere as you would think. Of course, it's still a big historical moment, a milestone that still kind of people remember
But it
half a
feels very, like,
years
it
ago.
sounds very benign, when you think about what happened when the Spanish invaded the sort of, the caliphate in Andalusia, in like the swap was anything but peaceful, and the change was extremely drastic. So in that sense, like, it hardly sounds like a conquest at all. More
I
like a
guess
peaceful transfer of power of some kind.
so obviously the city of Constantinople was conquered after a long siege, and that was a violent event because the city did not surrender. But for instance, the area that I've studied, we can come into that later, but I've studied another territory quite far from Constantinople. So I've studied the city of Trebizond, which is in the eastern Black Sea. And actually, that was something that was its own state in the late period. So it wasn't part of the Byzantine Empire, but it's still part of Byzantine history because there is, well, there are many reasons for that, but basically continuity in its rulers and culture and religion. Trebizond surrendered, and it actually surrendered later than Constantinople. So again, talking about Constantinople was conquered, it was a shock, it was violent, it was a massive disruption. But then 8 years on from then, we still have Trebizond. It was besieged and it surrendered. So it was a more peaceful transition over there. And when you think about kind of territories which no longer were under Byzantine rule, again, change of power had happened there earlier. And in many cities, actually, kind of the citizens faced with the option of sticking with their Byzantine governor or getting a new Turkish governor would actually voluntarily take the new governor because they were given tax exemptions and all sorts of other incentives. So it wasn't always a bad thing. It wasn't always a horrible thing. Obviously, there is always violence with the conquest. Obviously, there are always shocking narratives about defeat and about victory and blood flowing in the streets and horrible things done to women and whatnot. But that's part of conquest. That's part of the conquest narrative. And yeah, that was something that actually was one of the first things I studied when I came into kind of specializing on Byzantine history. I was looking at prophecies and supernatural phenomena and kind of omens and this kind of sense of fear at the fall of Constantinople. So that's what I did before I then went on to do my PhD on Trebizond. So two quite different topics, but both in this late period.
It's you were mentioning quite a bit about how important it is to get like this sort of feeling of the ambience of a place and the character of a place, whether it's from music or something else. And but when it comes to the kind of how fragmented the documents are, like how do you create a coherent image of an ancient culture from the fragments
Mm.
found?
It's a good question. I love this question. And basically, it's it's a bit of detective work, and obviously it would be much easier to study, let's say, Western medieval history because you have such a wealth of evidence. So it's very much, and I think this is where we really get to the heart of storytelling. So kind of sticking with the theme of this podcast, and I would say there are kind of two different types of storytelling taking place here. It is storytelling. It's also, I would say, that kind of parsing together the evidence. It's detective work, to use a bit of a cliche, but also when you present the work to academia, it's very much like imagine a court where you have a barrister. So you have someone bringing together the evidence, making their case. Obviously, it needs to be accurate. Obviously, it will be challenged and tested, so it needs to stand to scrutiny. But imagine someone at court making their case. This is what happened, and you might have, let's say, if it's a criminal court, you have the prosecution and you have the defense. Both sides are making their cases. And this is what happens in academia. You have people who look at the same evidence or slightly overlapping sets of evidence, and then they present their stories based on that. They present their cases. And I would like to think that obviously, if you're a good scholar, if you're confident, you will probably defend your case. But also, if you are a good scholar, you will kind of accept that we weren't there. We can't talk to the people who were there. There's all sorts of stuff that they've left behind, quite fragmented. But we have to accept that if new evidence surges or if emerges, or if anyone else kind of presents quite a plausible way in which this could make sense, there's also something about kind of accepting that you can change and revise your views. It's all different stories, different kind of versions of what could have happened that we tell each other in academia. But now I also mentioned that there is another type of storytelling, and that's, I think, where this kind of, I guess, sensory impressions and getting a bit of the ambience and vibe comes in. And I think that's where we try to connect with mainstream audiences. I think that's where it's less relevant what evidence we've used to construct this. Obviously, it's interesting to know, but the main point is bringing it to life. So really visualizing, really thinking about what was it like to live in that time. And I've always tried to do that as a bit of a mental exercise. If we do all this, let's look at all these beautiful academic theories. There's X, Y, and Z. Does it make sense from a human perspective? Could people have behaved like that? Were people really different from how they are now? In which ways were they different? In which ways were they similar? How did this make sense? Was this a bit like a foreign culture? So basically sense checking it all. But also I think if you think about popularization of history, the kind of mental images I like to use are kind of imagine a reconstructed monument, something that's been in ruins and that has been partially restored. And then also imagine a museum object, let's say a bowl that's made of little shards. So you can see in the bowl, you can see where the little shards have been glued together. But what really matters is that you have the bowl that's been put together, beautifully presented in a museum. You get a sense of what it looked like before it broke, when it was still being used. You get a sense of its story. You can imagine people eating fruit or some delicious meal of it. Same with the object, same with the monument. You can see that this might be a bit of an old fresco, this might be some sort of old stones. It's all very interesting. And then you can see where they put concrete and where they're just kind of painted white, let's say, where you've lost a piece of fresco. So you can see kind of what is new, what is old, but you can still get a sense when you zoom out, you can still get a sense of what the building was like. What did it feel like to be there? Where did the light come from? Those sorts of things. And I think we do need to apply this exercise for our written materials as well. So hope that makes sense, kind of two different types of storytelling. So this is what I do in academia. I kind of I look at something where the evidence, an era and a location where the evidence is quite fragmentary. I kind of stepped up the challenge for myself for the PhD, and I went to look at Trebizond, for which there's far less evidence than for Byzantium. So if there's already little and very confusing evidence for the late medieval Byzantine Empire, there's even less for Trebizond. I took it as a challenge, and actually you can find all sorts, and you can also I guess you can also be quite a sobering exercise to see that when everyone has looked at this evidence and they've made these conclusions and everyone just follows the same conclusions, I could actually look at the same evidence and be, hang on, actually, we don't know that. We don't know that. We shouldn't jump to that conclusion. That's one way of looking at things. But also, it could have made sense this way. And I can show that actually I've told a different story. I've looked at exactly the same things that my predecessors have. I haven't come up with any new evidence. I have had access to what everyone else has had access to, but I could still come up with a different theory and a different explanation. And that doesn't mean that I'm trying to say I'm right. I mean, I do believe I'm right, but that's more to say that, look, let's kind of remember we are this distant from the material that we are studying. We can never know what happened, but it's quite exciting to think about the world of possibilities.
Yes, I mean, for sure, it's coming to the sort of next topic that I wanted to sort of bring out from that, which is as important as storytelling is in history, because after all, like if we don't present it as a story, then people will not be able to understand it,
Mm.
um, or learn from it. But the difficulty is that we all come to information with our own sets of biases, with our own sets of maybe agenda, like in terms of further of history for generations, people in the academia genuinely believed that there were no female warriors in the Viking era, right? Because it was just coming from deeply patriarchal societies. It was almost unbelievable that it could be, or there were when it comes to one of the greatest philosophers in history, Socrates, right? And he was a student of a woman philosopher, and yet nobody is being taught about it. It's almost like she was kind of glossed over in the records. And I mean, of course, Byzantium being an offshoot of the Roman Empire, which was extremely patriarchal. I wouldn't expect there to be many surprises there in that sense. But how do you tackle the thing that have you seen much evidence of people using their own kind of political leanings or societal kind of prejudices in how they interpret the historical evidence?
That's a great question, and you've come up with some really good examples. Well, first of all, I did want to say that there are many surprises to find in Byzantium, and it's quite inspiring for me to be a female historian. I don't do women's history; I do mainstream history. But I
Which
also don't think
50% of it is women's history. That's
exactly, and that's what I was going to say. It shouldn't be seen as kind of mainstream history and women's history. Women were an intrinsic part of all the history that there exists, and when we look for them, we see them, and we don't have to look that hard. We just need to like not look away. We do need to notice them. I have noticed them, and in Trebizond, you have some really, really powerful women, some really interesting stories. It's again kind of looking at this person is mentioned there throughout. She was in a really, really powerful position. For instance, we have a civil war that took place, and this was a civil war between two women who both were rulers. They were both widows of the emperor, of the ruler who had died. So again, both of them had their factions supporting them to power. You had another woman of whom there was some quite nasty kind of rumors about what her profession had been before she became the emperor's lover and the empress. But she was really, really powerful. It's quite an inspiring story. And her son, who was the emperor, he got into power at the age of 12. So obviously his mom was in quite an influential position. It's just no one ever thinks about it. We are looking at, oh, this guy, he ruled for 45 years. He was really successful. Well, he accessed the throne at the age of 12. So his mom stuck around until, pretty much she lived until a very advanced age. So obviously she was a really important presence. She always followed her son to expeditions. She helped him negotiate with his neighbors who were Turkic rulers. She may have been of Turkish origin herself. So when we start looking at these people, we actually see really interesting stories. And absolutely, as you've said, we do see sometimes, you look at kind of older generation of historians who have dismissed, oh yeah, you had some female emperors and you have some female, well, sorry, I don't use the term empire for Trebizond, but that's the term that was used. You had some empresses, some even struck their own coins, some even entered a civil war with each other, but that was just an exception. That wasn't important, that wasn't relevant. So it is quite empowering to be looking at this as someone who doesn't have those biases. But I guess onto your main question. I mean, I mentioned that Byzantine studies is quite an interesting field because most people who end up doing this have a really good reason for doing Byzantine studies, and obviously everyone has their own reasons. For some, it's just pure academic curiosity. I didn't know anything about Byzantium. I started finding out, and I found it was really, really interesting. And you get people from all sorts of backgrounds, or there might be people who come from the Byzantine kind of territories that used to be part of the Byzantine Empire, or in whose culture the Byzantine legacy was really important. So it's quite similar. There's something quite similar that happens with both Byzantine and Ottoman history. So not just for the Byzantine history, but similarly for the Ottoman stuff, kind of what it meant can define your perception. So what did the Byzantine period mean for your national history? Did kind of freedom from Byzantine rule mean that your own national identity developed? Often you see the origins of modern nation states in the medieval period. So this is a really, really important time to study. Or what did Ottoman rule mean? Similarly, did kind of Ottoman rule and the fact that kind of your country used to be part of the Ottoman Empire for some time, did that mean that you became really interested in Ottoman history? Or did you see that as part of your history? Or did you see that as not part of your history, if that makes sense? And it's the same things that happen here. For the Byzantine period, it's quite interesting that there's no successor to the Byzantine Empire. It got conquered by the Ottomans. So technically, modern Turkey is the successor of the Byzantine Empire. Of course, Greece has that cultural continuity in terms of language and heritage and religion, but not Constantinople, not the kind of hot Byzantine territory. So there are many parts of the world which have kind of, I would say that pretty much most of the countries, well, all the countries in that part of the world have kind of their part to play in the Byzantine legacy. And it's up to every scholar to kind of think, what brings them to study Byzantine history? Is it that personal connection? This is my history. I want to understand it properly. I want to kind of, let's say, scrape off all these modern layers of interpretation and understand what things actually were like. What is this lost empire, of lost territory, lost rule? It is something that's been lost. It is something that hasn't been succeeded by a modern state. And ultimately, it is the responsibility of all of us to kind of be aware of our biases. It can help to have a personal connection, and people who don't have a personal connection can have all sorts of other biases. You mentioned patriarchy. There could be all sorts of, even these kind of negative perceptions can have kind of affected why you got interested in the Byzantine Empire. It could be almost familiar to kind of, you may have liked those kind of tales of intrigue and, gold and whatever decline,
The
and
kind
you
of
may not.
exoticizing, yeah.
Exactly. So you may
Yeah.
not want to kind of think. So I say that I guess the kind of question about testing our bias is one that applies for each scholar, regardless of where they come from. It's our own responsibility to kind of be aware of them. And yeah, it's we all bring our biases to the picture, but we do need to try to be as strive to be as free from them as possible. So yeah, but it can be an interesting exercise to kind of uncover things that you thought you knew and then realize that actually it's something quite different. And there are some really, really amazing scholars coming from so many different countries. It's a really international field. You have Byzantine studies pretty much in all continents of the world and some big centers of excellence, both in the countries that used to be kind of in the Byzantine culture of influence in the kind of broadest way of interpreting it. I'm not using very exact language here, or then in countries that don't have Byzantine legacy, but where kind of research has just developed for other reasons, or indeed sprung up from classical studies. I was quite lucky. I did my PhD in Birmingham, where Byzantine studies sits as part of the Center for Byzantine, Ottoman, and Modern Greek Studies. So again, it's a center that brings together that continuity and brings together kind of scholars studying not just Byzantine history, but also what happened afterwards. But often Byzantine studies is kind of part of classics department. So you have the ancient history, classical history, and then you have the kind of exotic offshoot, the Byzantine Empire. So yeah, there are many ways to kind of position it, so to
So with
say.
all those, people seeking a greater understanding of sort of ancient Byzantine history, what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of Byzantium?
Yeah, I think I've touched upon it a little bit. So I guess first of all that it was irrelevant, or that it was uninteresting, or super religious, and also I think one of the things that's particularly quite annoying about the English language is the adjective Byzantine with a small b, which means quite negative things about kind of machinery of court intrigue and all sorts of kind of really really deviant intrigue taking place. I mean, wherever you have political power, wherever you have people of influence, you do have intrigue. You have that in the corporate world, you have that in politics, you have that everywhere. So intrigue is just the fact that there were people competing for power, but there wasn't kind of more intrigue in the Byzantine Empire than elsewhere in the world. So this association isn't right. And there's this kind of, I guess, when I got interested in medieval history to begin with, I went for Western medieval history because I thought it was fascinating, and I was like, "There's nothing there in the East." I didn't. It was just empty, and that's because, well, it wasn't known. So I guess even my mind was affected by these kind of preconceived notions that it's uninteresting, irrelevant. There was nothing happening there. There were really cool, interesting things happening in the West. Hopefully, I've had a chance to make up for that now, becoming an expert in the field. But that's the thing. And I guess it's a shame that it's not very well known and not learned about, particularly in Western countries, because there's so much to discover. There's so much more to do.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as to its importance, I think nobody could dispute it now. And, it was always such an important international hub. That's why so many different empires wanted it for themselves. Um, how did the cultural identity of Byzantium develop over the centuries?
Mhm. This is actually this is a big question, and it's one that's actually debated in academia. So it's this there's a lot of really really good recent scholarship on what would the Byzantines, what did they call themselves? What should we call them? Should we call them Romans, East Romans? Was it a Hellenic Empire? Should we just stick with the term Byzantines? And what do these terms mean? Was it an empire? What does all of this mean in different contexts? So yeah, there's an interesting debate going on, and it's far from straightforward. I think there are many ways of looking at what were the kind of cornerstones of Byzantine identity. How did that change and develop? Because 1,000 years is a really long period of time, and all sorts of things happened in them. So of course, its identity also evolved. I guess the way in which I look at it is kind of slightly a different perspective. Again, I mentioned kind of sense checking and making sense of it for myself. The way in which I see Constantinople is that it was the medieval version of what London is today. I mean, London is something that's been called the most international city in the world. Some may agree or disagree or come up with their own alternatives, but just think about the number of cultures represented in London, the number of shops, restaurants, you can get food from all possible cuisines, and kind of people living together. And
I mean, on this podcast, there's a Pole talking to a Finnish lady in London. So
there we go. Exactly. That's a
so
good example. Yeah, and I mean, if you look for any culture, if you want to engage with people of any community, you probably will find representatives of that in London. Just exploring the different restaurants you find in London has been interesting for me enough. So when you go back to medieval Constantinople, what you'd find is something quite similar. The same goes for Ottoman Istanbul. It was the same city, it was the same vibe. So you'd find different languages, see different religions, sample all sorts of really interesting cuisines, buy items from pretty much all across the Mediterranean world or further. You could wander down the streets. You could find a trading hub by Venetian or Genoese merchants. They ran the trade and transport networks during the late medieval period in the Black Sea. So they'd be bringing all sorts of interesting things. Also, the Venetians and Genoese were always at war with each other, so there would be some conflict or bickering happening. You'd find Coptic or Syriac priests wandering around. Perhaps in the early period, you'd find a shipment of grain from Egypt. You could find Armenians, Georgians, Bulgarians. You could find synagogues. You could find all the different languages. It was really busy. It was really populous. There was all the time something happening. It had a really busy administration, a very sophisticated civil service, pretty much like the one we have in the UK. And if you were really lucky, and if you were out and about on the streets on a special day, you might even spot a glimpse of a member of the imperial family. Actually, during the late period, they staged these really spectacular appearances. So they made a big show of coming out and presenting themselves to the population. So it was quite a happening place. But yet, again, comparing with London, there was still a distinct and fascinating sense of kind of cultural identity, even if it was this multicultural hub. Something that where the location kind of brought people together. There was a sense that this was the center of the world. And the people of Constantinople were quite arrogant and looked down upon other parts of the Byzantine world. They had this very capital-centric approach, thinking that,
so
everything
unlike London. That doesn't sound like London at all.
But yeah, you had everything you could imagine to leave the city.
Yeah.
Why would you want to go if you had to leave the city? Transport would be horrible. Why would you want to go? It was a misfortune. There were people actually lamenting that they had to go and make a trip outside Constantinople, even if
it's like I'm hearing some of my London friends actually right now.
exactly. So that's what you get. But of course, I mean, there is often this very Constantinople-centric approach to studying Byzantine history, and I went to study something very, very different. So when you zoom out, and the Byzantine world was much greater than just its capital, and it's really, really interesting to kind of go and study it from its peripheries. So what was the identity like at the kind of fringes of Byzantine culture? The part of the world I've studied is right at the foot of the Caucasus Mountains, right at the kind of intersection between Black Sea, Caucasian, Turkic culture, Asian Anatolian culture, and Byzantine culture. what did the idea of Constantinople mean for those people? Did they actually feel inferior? No, obviously not. How did they look at the arrogant Constantinopolitans, and what kind of things, what kind of perceptions and ideas kind of traveled across all the way to that part of the world? So yeah, those are the sorts of things
So
I
what
find.
were they?
Oh, it's I think there's something to do with kind of how imperial rule was kind of set up, what an emperor would look like, how they would, what sort of titles would they use, how would they dress, what sort of court would they have
Mm.
around them, and then how does this help kind of, but I think what happened, sorry, I'll say again, I guess what happened in Trebizond is they kind of very much looked to Constantinople and how kind of imperial rule is set up there. And the rulers of Trebizond actually came from a family, they were descendants of a Byzantine emperor, so there was direct continuity. But when they established rule in Trebizond, they did something completely of their own. So they took those models and kind of repurposed them for their own purposes and set up a new state or a new kind of late medieval political formation that was not part of the Byzantine Empire, but that was in some ways modeled along it. So it's really fascinating.
Wow, it's do you feel like they felt that they had like there's something very distinct going on? Was
There
there
is
like
some,
did they feel very separate or
it's always been an area with its own identity, but basically what the rulers in Trebizond needed to do was to stay in power. They didn't really care about what was happening in Constantinople. The kind of elite factions that were kind of grouping together and supporting certain candidates to the throne, they could seek support from Constantinople, and that's what I've studied in detail. And that's quite a fascinating phenomenon where you still see the influence of Constantinople, even if it's not politically connected to Trebizond as such. But what happened is you could see the various elites whose support was absolutely crucial for the rulers in Trebizond. So they were given court titles similar to what was done in the Byzantine in Constantinople, and that was a way to kind of give hierarchies to the elites and put them into an order, and they could
Mm.
compete for titles and end up kind of clashing with each other sometimes. But again, that was a way to kind of organize this area. And when they were given titles of something that looked quite prestigious and something that looked not so different from all these, great elites and officials in Constantinople, that kind of elevated their status. So it was kind of this portable model of how to set up a rule with authority. So yeah, and it's Trebizond wasn't the only place where it was done, but I've kind of focused on looking at what happened there and how that model was used so successfully.
You also mentioned you studied in greater detail the kind of supernatural experiences around the
Mm.
fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans. And um, can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's interesting, in terms of religion, the main ones obviously are the kind of the Eastern Church and the Christians and the Islam. Like those supernatural like the prophecies and all that, like where did it which cultures did they stem from first of all, and what what was like.
Yeah, so it's again, that's a really, really interesting topic to look at kind of the supernatural, the kind of occult sciences, and it was something that was very much flourishing in the medieval world. So there were prophecies and traditions that traveled across cultures. But I guess what I did not specialize was the origin of these prophecies, but more kind of how they colored people's experiences. So picture this: we are coming to the final siege of Constantinople, which lasted a few months, and it wasn't looking very good. Pretty much anyone who had been able to leave the city had left by then. Turkish troops were besieging the city, and they were making good progress. And there were few defenders left, and it was just a matter of time when the city would collapse. But the defenders did defend. They kind of held they kind of stood up and fought very bravely until the very end. This was also a very kind of early example of the successful use of cannons, and it was the cannons that ultimately broke the amazing land walls of Constantinople and allowed for it to be occupied. But I was interested in just what's happening in the minds of these people and how this kind of, where we have sources about prophecies, how that kind of is a reflection of something psychological. So this kind of panic, people trying to make sense of it. Surely the world can't come, surely Constantinople can't come to an end, because if that happened, the world would come to an end. Constantinople is meant to last forever. So it can't happen. Let's just relax. Or if this comes to an end, what does it mean? Are there signs that the world is coming to an end? Will the world come to an end if the city is conquered? And basically, people were just looking for anything as kind of omens, um, eclipses, strange thunderstorms, strange fogs, weird things happening on the streets. But it was this
I
kind
feel
of
like I'm listening to the modern day news.
I I did this research back in 2011 and 2010 and 2011, and it was around the time when there was this horrible tsunami in Japan, the horrible earthquakes and tsunami, and you had these news headlines, apocalypse, and I was like, well, there we go. It was something, people are experiencing something really, really devastating. They can't make sense of it in ways other that the world is coming to an end. We see signs of the end of the world. And of course, I'm also kind of always keeping an eye on. I have lived through the Y2K frenzy and people thinking that our computer systems will cause airplanes to drop from the sky, or what was it, the weird Mayan, or was it the Mayan calendar that
Oh
predicted the end
yeah.
of the world in 2012? So it felt like it's a mentality that happened. But it was happening on the other side as well. So the besieging Turks, they had to keep up morale and believe that they can conquer the city and something really great is going to happen. So they were also looking for signs. So basically, there were ways in which kind of people try to just make sense of what was going on by using old prophecies, by kind of looking, okay, there's this story. There's this story. What do we do? Where do we go? Oh, there's a story that said if you cross this column, if you get past this column, then you can't be hurt. So let's just do that. Or let's just kind of converge all here. And if we're here, an angel will come from the sky and save us. Yeah, it's quite. I mean, it just tells about the shock and panic. And obviously, this is in the context going back to what we spoke about a few minutes ago about the kind of violent conquest and the panic and the utter fear and dread that people experience. So it is quite a kind of emotionally
Of course.
compelling narrative to study, but also then looking at kind of various reflections and various ways in which people made sense of it afterwards. It is an important moment in history, and it's important to kind of, I guess it's important that we understand the legacy of that moment, but we don't let that color the way in which we looked at the 1,000 years that preceded that moment. So, because I think that's such an impactful event in history that some
Of
people still
course.
are over that conquest. So it's weird that something that happened so long ago still can kind of, yeah, kind of
So
upset people.
is there like a small story, like maybe a more personal story from that time that you have uncovered that has captured your imagination the most?
I think so. I think when I first went to Istanbul and when I visited the Hagia Sophia and when I read about it, it is such an imposing monument. I mean, if yeah, I would recommend to anyone who gets a chance to just go and see it. It is something else. And yeah, I was imagining what would it have been like for the people who then experienced the final siege when they just finally huddled up in the church and waited for the inevitable to happen. So yeah, it was kind of imagining that and kind of starting from that moment of tragedy and conquest and shock and horror, and then looking at everything else, all this kind of narratives about peaceful transition, and it wasn't such a big deal for everyone. So yeah, you get a spectrum of experiences. But again, I was interested in understanding what did it feel like, what did different people experience, what happened to them.
Um, what is since not that much sort of detail of Byzantium is known and in kind of or like in popular culture. So what is the best popular culture representation of ancient Byzantium in your view?
You're spot on that there isn't much. I really, really wish there was a film or a TV series that kind of depicted Byzantine history in the way in which I see it, I guess. This is obviously my kind of personal reflections, and I'm sure there are films and TV series that someone else might think that might have
Yeah,
been
I suppose
inspiring.
there are quite a few like TV series like in Turkish about like the Ottoman Empire and the court of the Ottoman Empire,
I,
but not
yeah.
Byzantium specifically.
So actually, those I was going to mention them. They are on my list. I was going to say that because there isn't something that brings the Byzantine history to life, I would look at those Turkish series because they are actually yeah, I think a lot of effort has been made in again that kind of making them emotionally captivating, bringing that court alive. The Magnificent Century series, Muhteşem Yüzyıl, is something that's hugely popular in many parts of the world. Not so much in Western Europe, not so much in the UK, although you can find it on YouTube with English subtitles. But it's really, really popular in many countries. My particular favorite is the spin-off version, the Kösem version of that. I really recommend it because it brings the period of alive. Obviously, it's
Can you
Ottoman
repeat the
history.
title? Sorry, just for.
Yeah, and I'll send you the link so you can also add it in the show notes. But it's called Magnificent Century, and that's something. Basically, each episode is 2 hours movie length, and there are many of them. I mean, it takes years to watch it all through, but it goes into good amount of detail, and it's something that really does help you immerse yourself. And because we are fortunate to have the Ottoman the palaces of the Ottoman sultans are still left. We don't have the palace of the Byzantine emperors. So actually these are filmed in original locations. You can get quite a realistic sense of what it looked like. So they're very well made. In terms of another kind of really good way in which you can kind of immerse yourself in Constantinople. It's again post-Byzantine, but this is the Assassin's Creed computer game, Assassin's Creed Revelations, which is set in Constantinople about 60 years after the conquest by the Ottomans. So it's Ottoman Constantinople, but not that long after the conquest. And it's a really, really well-made reconstruction of the city. And again, you can, if you don't want to play the game, you can find gameplay videos on YouTube, for instance, of the sections where the main protagonist climbs around in Hagia Sophia. Really well made, and historians have been consulted for that. On which note, I'd also like to mention there's a site called Byzantium 1200, which is kind of digital reconstructions of the various monuments in Constantinople, the way in which they would have looked in the year 1200. And again, kind of going more to the Middle Ages. This is not a film about the Byzantine Empire, but it's about the same period. Again, a kind of well-known mainstream film. It's a Ridley Scott film called Kingdom of Heaven. I definitely would warmly recommend the director's cut, which is so much better than the theatrical version, although it is 3 hours. So, take some good snacks.
So
And
all of those so Annika will send me some links
I will.
later, and I will sort of copy them so you can access all of those wonderful materials, well, maybe not Assassin's Creed, but through the links under the video. And the kind of a last question for those underachievers among us who do not read in 19 languages, what are the are there any books or sort of more popular history books that you would recommend?
Yeah, there are some really, really good resources. So actually, academics who are far more senior and well established than myself, who have done their careers in researching Byzantine history, they have taken the time to write about some of the cool stuff that they have discovered. So again, I'll send you a list of various recommendations. So there are a few books that kind of focus on certain parts of the Byzantine Empire, certain phenomena or kind of topics that are quite written in a way that are quite accessible for the general reader, such as Byzantine Matters, for instance, that kind of focus on different themes. Or there's something called A Cabinet of Byzantine Curiosities, which is kind of strange tales and funny anecdotes. So again, a nice
amazing.
It's not an overview of the history, but it's again something to kind of bring it a bit more alive. There are some great kind of introductory books if you just want to learn about the history and again kind of read the interesting stuff, maybe with less academic debate, but just kind of understand what it was all about.
A Cabinet of Curiosities sounds right up my street, actually. For the magpies among us, that sounds just perfect. So
It's
again,
brilliant.
I will place the names of the books under the video if anybody is interested in sort of delving a little bit deeper. So on that note, thank you so much, Annika, for coming on the show. I really enjoyed our chat. And
Likewise, thank
I feel
you.
like I know a little bit more now about Byzantium, which is the whole point, isn't it?
I'll send you a few links and I'll mention a few things I didn't kind of talk through in detail, but hopefully that's a starting point. And obviously, yeah, if any of the listeners feel like they would like to kind of suggest areas on which they'd like to see history popularized or kind of yeah, areas that they would like to learn about Byzantium. It would be interesting to see those in comments. And obviously
Yes.
there are academics constantly doing this outreach work. Some really, really brilliant materials are being produced. So there is that interaction between academia and the general audience and all sorts of interesting stuff to look out for. But thank you so much, Gabriela, for having me here today.
Thank you.
It's been a good conversation and yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So any comments, you guys write under the video so that Annika knows what she should focus on in her future research endeavors.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching the video. Click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you and see you next week.